Isn't that surprising to you that this kind of low level dumb training procedure can create something syntactically correct first and then semantically correct
You know,
second?
the thing that has been sort of a story of my life is realizing
Yeah.
that simple rules can do much more complicated things than you imagine. That
Yeah.
something that starts simple and starts simple to describe can grow a thing that is, vastly more complicated than you can imagine.
Yeah.
And honestly, it's taken me, I mean, I don't know, I've sort of been thinking about this now 40 years or so. And it always surprises me. I mean, even for example, in our physics project, sort of thinking about the whole universe growing from these simple rules, I still resist because I keep on thinking, how can something really complicated arise from something that simple?
Mhm.
It just seems, it seems wrong, but yet, the majority of my life I've kind of known from things I've studied that this is the way things work. So yes, it is wild that it's possible to write a word at a time and produce a coherent essay, for example. But it's worth understanding kind of how that's working. I mean, it's kind of like if it was going to say, the cat sat on the, what's the next word? Okay, so how does it figure out the next word? Well, it's seen a trillion words written on the internet, and it's seen the cat sat on the floor, the cat sat on the sofa, the cat sat on the whatever.
Mhm.
So its minimal thing to do is just say, let's look at what we saw on the internet. We saw, 10,000 examples of the cat sat on the.
Mhm.
What was the most probable next word? Let's just pick that out and say that's the next word. And that's kind of what it at some level is trying to do. Now the problem is there isn't enough text on the internet to for if you have a reasonable length of prompt to that specific prompt will never have occurred on the
Mhm.
internet. And as you kind of go further, there just won't be a place where you could have trained, where you could just worked out probabilities from what was already there.
Mhm.
Like if you say 2 plus 2, there'll be a zillion examples of 2 plus 2
Mhm.
equaling 4, and a very small number of examples of 2 plus 2 equals 5,
Mhm.
and so on. And you can pretty much know what's going to happen. So then the question is, well, if you can't just work out from examples what's going to happen, just no probabilistic from examples what's going to happen, you have to have a model. And there's kind of this idea of making models of things is an idea that really, I don't know, I think Galileo probably was one of the first people who sort of worked this out. I mean, it's kind of like, I think I gave an example of that, the little book I wrote about ChatGPT, where it's kind of like, Galileo was dropping cannonballs off the different floors of the Tower of Pisa. And it's like, okay, you drop a cannonball off this floor, you drop a cannonball off this floor, you miss floor 5 or something for
Mhm.
whatever reason, but you know the time it took the cannonball to fall to the ground from floors 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, 7, 8, for example. Then the question is, can you work out, can you make a model which figures out how long did it take the ball, how long would it take the ball to fall to the ground from the floor you didn't explicitly measure? And the thing Galileo realized is that you can use math, you can use mathematical formulas to make a model for how long it will take the ball to fall. So
Mhm.
now the question is, well, okay, you want to make a model for example, something much more elaborate, like you've got this arrangement of pixels, and is this arrangement of pixels an A or a B? Does it correspond to something we'd recognize as an A or a B? And you can make a similar kind, each pixel is like a parameter in some equation, and you could write down this giant equation where the answer is either, A or, 1 or 2, A or B. And the question is then, what kind of a model successfully reproduces the way that we humans would conclude that this is an A and this is a B? If there's a complicated extra tail on the top of the A, would we then conclude something different? What is the type of model that maps well into the way that we humans make distinctions about things? And the big kind of meta discovery is neural nets are such a model. It's not obvious they would be such a model. It could be that human distinctions are not captured. We could try searching around for a type
Mhm.
of model that could be a mathematical model, it could be some model based on something else that captures kind of typical human distinctions about things.
Mhm.
It turns out this model that actually is very much the way that we think the architecture of brains works, that perhaps not surprisingly, that model actually corresponds to the way we make these distinctions. And so, the core next point is that the kind of model, this neural net model, makes sort of distinctions and generalizes things in sort of the same way that we humans do it.
Mhm.
And that's why when you say, the cat sat on the green blank, even though it didn't see many examples of the cat sat on the green whatever, it can make or the aardvark sat on the green whatever. I'm sure that particular sentence does not occur on the internet. And so it has to make a model that concludes what, it has to kind of generalize from from the actual examples that it's seen. And that's the fact is that neural nets generalize in the same kind of a way that we humans do. If we were, the aliens might look at our neural net generalizations and say, that's crazy. That thing, when you put that extra little dot on the A, that isn't an A anymore. That messed the whole thing up. But for us humans, we make distinctions which seem to correspond to the kinds of distinctions that neural nets make. So then, the thing that is just amazing to me about ChatGPT is how similar the structure it has is to the very original way people imagined neural nets might work
Mhm.
back in 1943.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of detailed engineering, great cleverness, but it's really the same idea. And in fact, even the sort of elaborations of that idea where people said, let's put in some actual particular structure to try and make the neural net more elaborate, to be very clever about it,
Mhm.
most of that didn't matter. I mean, there's some things that seem to, when you train this neural net, the one thing, this kind of transformer architecture, this attention idea, that really has to do with, does every one of these neurons connect to every other neuron?
Mhm.
Or is it somehow causally localized, so to speak? Does it like we're making a sequence of words and the words depend on previous words
Mhm.
rather than just everything can depend on everything? And that seems to be important in just organizing things so that you don't have a sort of a giant mess.
Mhm.
But the thing worth understanding about what is ChatGPT in the end? I mean, what is a neural net in the end? A neural net in the end is each neuron has it's taking inputs from a bunch of other neurons. It's eventually it's going to have a numerical value. It's going to compute some number, and it's saying I'm going to look at the neurons above me. It's kind of a series of layers. It's going to look at the neurons above me, and it's going to say what are the values of all those neurons. Then it's going to add those up and multiply them by these weights. And then it's going to apply some function that says if it's bigger than 0 or something, then make it 1, or and otherwise make it 0, or some slightly more complicated function. You know very well how this works.
But it's a giant equation with a lot of variables. You mentioned figuring out where the ball falls when you don't have data on the fourth floor.
Right.
The equation here is not as simple as
Right.
the
It's an
equation,
equation with 175 billion terms,
and
as
it's
opposed to
quite surprising that, in some sense, a simple procedure of training such an equation can lead to
well, I think
a
that
good representation of natural language.
right. The real issue is, this architecture of a neural net where what's happening is, you've turned so neural nets always just deal with numbers.
Hmm.
And so, you've turned the sentence that you started with into a bunch of numbers. Like, let's say by mapping, each word of the 50,000 words in English, you just map each word or each part of a word into some number. You feed all those numbers in, and then and then those numbers just go into the values of these neurons. And then what happens is it's just rippling down, going layer to layer until it gets to the end. I think ChatGPT has about 400 layers. And it just goes once through. It just, every new word it's going to compute just says, here are the numbers from the words before. Let's compute what does it compute? It computes the probabilities that it estimates for each of the possible 50,000 words that could come next. And then it decides, sometimes it will use the most probable word, sometimes it will use not the most probable word. It's an interesting fact that there's this so-called temperature parameter, which, at temperature 0, it's always using the most probable word that it estimated was the most probable thing to come next. If you increase the temperature, it'll be more and more kind of random in its selection of words. It'll go down to lower and lower probability words. The thing I was just playing with actually recently was the transition that happens as you increase the temperature. The thing goes bonkers at a particular, sometimes at a particular temperature. I think maybe about 1.2 is the thing I was noticing
Hmm.
from yesterday, actually. That usually it's giving reasonable answers, and then at that temperature, with some probability, it just starts spouting nonsense.
Hmm.
And nobody knows why this happens.
Mm,
I mean, and by the way, I mean, the thing to understand is it's putting down one word at a time, but the outer loop of the fact that it says, okay, I put down a word. Now let's take the whole thing I wrote so far, let's feed that back in,
mhm,
let's put down another word. That outer loop, which seems almost trivial, is really important to the operation
mhm.
of the thing. And for example, one of the things that is kind of funky is it'll give an answer, and you say to it, "Is that answer correct?" And it'll say, "No." And why is that
It's
happening?
fascinating, right?
Right? Why can it do that? Well, the answer is because it is going one word at a time, sort of forwards,
Mhm,
and it didn't. It came along with some sort of chain of thought in a sense, and it came up with completely the wrong answer.
mhm,
But as soon as you feed it the whole thing that it came up with,
mhm,
it immediately knows that that isn't right. It immediately can recognize that was a bad syllogism or something,
mhm.
and can see what happened. Even though, as it was being led down this garden path, so to speak, it didn't. It came to the wrong place.
But it's fascinating that this kind of procedure converges to something that forms a pretty good compressed representation of language on the internet.
Yeah.
That's quite.
Right. 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 No. I'm
I'm not sure what to make of it.
Well, look, I think, there are many things we don't understand. Okay. So, for example, 175 billion weights, it's maybe about a trillion bytes of information, which is very comparable to the training set that was used. Um, and why that? Why kind of it sort of stands to some kind of reason that the number of weights in the neural net. I don't know. Really, I can't really argue that. I can't really give you a good example. In a sense, the very fact that insofar as there are definite rules of what's going on, you might expect that eventually we'll have a much smaller neural net that will successfully capture what's happening. I don't think the best way to do it is probably a neural net. I think a neural net is what you do when you don't know any other way to structure the thing. And it's a very good thing to do if you don't know any other way to structure the thing. And for the last 2,000 years, we haven't known any other way to structure it.
Mhm.
So this is a pretty good way to start. But that doesn't mean you can't find sort of, in a sense, more symbolic rules for what's going on that, much of which will then be, you can kind of get rid of much of the structure of the neural net and replace it by things which are sort of pure steps of computation, so to speak, sort of with neural net stuff around the edges, and that becomes just a much simpler way to do it.
So the neural net, you hope, will reveal to us good symbolic rules
Yeah,
that make the need of the neural net less and less and less.
right. And there will still be some stuff that's kind of fuzzy, just like there are things that it's like this question of what can we formalize, what can we turn into computational language, what is just sort of it happens that way just because brains are set up that way.
What do you think are the limitations of large language models? Just to make it explicit.
Well, I mean, I think that deep computation is not what large language models do. I mean, it's a different kind of thing. The outer loop of a large language model, if you're trying to do many steps in a computation, the only way you get to do that right now is by spooling out, all the whole chain of thought as a
Hmm.
bunch of words,
Hmm.
basically. And you can make a Turing machine out of that if you want to. I just was doing that construction. In principle, you can make an arbitrary computation by just spooling out the words, but it's a bizarre and inefficient way to do it.
Hmm.
But it's something where I think that's sort of the deep computation is it's really what a humans can do quickly. Large language models will probably be able to do well. Anything that you can do kind of off the top of your head type thing is really, is good for large language models. And the things you do off the top of your head, you may not get them always right, but you'll it's thinking it through the same way we do.
But I wonder if there's an automated way to do something that humans do well much faster to where it like loops. So generate arbitrary large code bases of Wolfram language, for example.
Well, the question is, what do you want the code base to do?
Um, Escape control and take over the world.
Okay. So, the thing is, when people say, we want to build this giant thing,
Hmm.
right? A giant piece of computational language. In a sense, it's sort of a failure of computational language if the thing you have to build, in other words, if we have a description, if you have a small description, that's the thing that you represent in computational language. And then the computer can compute from that.
Yes.
So, in a sense, when as soon as you're giving a description, if you have to somehow make that description something, definite, something formal, and to say, okay, I'm going to give this piece of natural language, and then it's going to splurt out this giant formal structure. That, in a sense, that doesn't really make sense, because except insofar as that piece of natural language kind of plugs into what we socially know, so to speak, plugs into kind of our corpus of knowledge, then that's a way we're capturing a piece of that corpus of knowledge, but hopefully we will have done that in computational language. How do you make it do something that's big? Well, you have to have a way to describe what you want.
I can make it more explicit if you want. How about I just pop into my head. Um, Iterate through all the members of Congress and figure out how to convince them that they have to let me, meaning the system, become president. Pass all the laws that allows AI systems to take
Right.
control and be the president. I don't know. So that's a very explicit, like,
Yeah, yeah.
figure out the individual life story of each congressman, each senator, anybody. I don't know
Right.
what's required to really kind of pass legislation, and figure out how to control them and manipulate them. Get all
Right.
the information. What would be the biggest fear of this congressman? And in such a way that you can take action on it in the digital space. So maybe threaten the destruction reputation or something like this.
Right. If I can describe what I want,
Yeah.
to what extent can a large language model automate that?
With
And
the help of the concretization of something like Wolfram language that makes it
right.
more yeah,
I think it
grounded.
can go rather a long way.
I'm also surprised how quickly I was able to generate
Yeah, yeah, right.
an attack.
That's a yeah, you know,
I
it's
swear I did not think about this before, and it's funny how quickly, which is a very concerning thing, because that probably this idea will probably do quite a bit of damage, and there might be a very large number of other such ideas.
well, I'll give you a much more benign version of that idea.
Sure.
Okay, you're going to make an AI tutoring system,
Mhm.
and that's a benign version of what you're saying is, I want this person to understand this point.
Yes.
You're essentially doing machine learning where the the loss function, the thing you're trying to get to is get the human to understand this point, and when you do a test on the human, that they correctly understand how this or that works. And I am confident that sort of the large language model type technology combined with computational language is going to be able to do pretty well at teaching us humans things. And it's going to be an interesting phenomenon because, sort of individualized teaching is is a thing that has been kind of a goal for a long time. I think we're going to get that, and I think more, that it has many consequences for, like just, if you know me, if you, the AI, know me, tell me I'm about to do this thing. What are the three things I need to know? You know, given what I already know, let's say I'm looking at some paper or something, right? It's like there's a version of the summary of that paper that is optimized for me, so to speak,
Mhm.
and where it really is, and I think that's really going to work.
It could understand the major gaps in your knowledge
Yes,
that, if filled, would actually give you uh, a deeper understanding of the topic. Yeah.
right. And that's an important thing because it really changes. Actually, I think, when you think about education and so on, it really changes kind of what's worth doing, what's not worth doing, and so on. It makes, I know in my life I've learned lots of different fields, and so I don't know, every time I'm always think this is the one I'm not going to be able to learn.
Yeah.
But turns out sort of there are sort of meta methods for learning these things in the end. And I think this idea that it becomes easier to, it becomes easier to be fed knowledge, so to speak, and it becomes, if you need to know this particular thing, you can, you can get taught it in an efficient way, is something I think is sort of an interesting feature, and I think it makes the Things like the value of big towers of specialized knowledge become less significant compared to the kind of meta knowledge of sort of understanding kind of the big picture and being able to connect things together. I think that there's been this huge trend of let's be more and more specialized because we have to we have to sort of ascend these towers of knowledge. But by the time you can get more automation of being able to get to that place on the tower without having to go through all those steps, I think it sort of changes that picture.
Interesting. So your intuition is that in terms of the the, the collective intelligence of the species and the individual minds that make up that collective, there'll be more. They will trend towards being generalists and being kind of philosophers.
That's
On
what
that,
I think. I think that's where the humans are going to be useful. I think that a lot of these kind of the drilling, the mechanical working out of things is much more automatable. It's much more AI territory, so to speak.
no more PhDs.
Well, it's interesting. Yes, I mean, the kind of the specialization, this kind of tower of specialization, which has been a feature of we've accumulated lots of knowledge in our species, and in a sense, we every time we have a kind of automation, a building of tools, it becomes less necessary to know that whole tower, and it becomes something where you can just use a tool to get to the top of that tower. I think that the thing that is ultimately, when we think about, okay, what do the AIs do versus what do the humans do? It's like AIs, you tell them, you say, go achieve this particular objective. Okay, they can maybe figure out a way to achieve that objective. We say, what objective would you like to achieve? The AI has no intrinsic idea of that. It's not a defined thing. That's a thing which has to come from some other entity. And insofar as we are in charge, so to speak, or whatever it is, and our kind of web of society and history and so on is the thing that is defining what objective we want to go to. That's that's a thing that we humans are necessarily involved in, so to
But
speak.
to push back a little bit, don't you think that GPT, future versions of GPT, would be able to give a good answer to what objective would you like to achieve?
From on what basis? I mean, if they say, look, here's the terrible thing that could happen, okay? They're taking the average of the internet
Hmm.
and they're saying, you know, from the average of the internet, what do people want to do?
Well, that's the Elon Musk adage of the most entertaining outcome is the most likely.
Okay. I
So
haven't
that could
heard that
be
one from him. Yeah.
that could
Okay.
be that could be one objective is maximize global entertainment. The dark version of that is drama. The good version of that is fun.
Right. So I mean, this question of what uh, uh, you know, if you say to the AI, um, you know, what does the species want to achieve?
Yes,
Okay.
there'll be
That
an answer, right?
there'll be an answer. It'll be what the average of the internet says the species wants to achieve.
Well, that's. I think you're using the word average very loosely there,
I
right?
am.
So I think the answers will become more and more interesting as these language models are trained better and better.
No, but I mean, in the end, it's a reflection back of what we've already said.
Yes,
And
but it's there's a deeper wisdom to the collective intelligence, presumably, than each individual.
maybe.
Isn't that what we're trying to do as a
Well,
society?
uh, to
Like,
have well, I mean, that's an important, that's an interesting question. I mean, in insofar as some of us, work on trying to innovate and figure out new things and so on, it is sometimes it's a complicated interplay between sort of the individual doing the crazy thing off in some spur, so to speak, versus the collective that's trying to do sort of the high inertia average thing. And
mhm.
it's sometimes the collective is bubbling up things that are interesting, and sometimes it's pulling down kind of the attempt to make this kind of innovative direction.
But don't you think the large language models will see beyond that simplification? Will say maybe intellectual and career diversity is really important. So you need the crazy people on
But
the outlier, on the
right.
outskirts. And so, like, the actual, what's the purpose of this whole thing is to explore through this kind of dynamics that we've been using as a human civilization, which is most of us focus on one thing, and then there's the crazy people on the outskirts doing the opposite of that one thing, and you kind of like pull the whole society together. There's the mainstream science, and then there's the crazy science. And that's just been the history of human civilization. And maybe the AI system will be able to see that. And the more and more impressed we are by a language model telling us this, the more control we'll give it to it, and the more we'll be willing to let it run our society. And hence, there's this kind of loop where
Sure.
the society could be manipulated to let the AI system run it.
Right. Well, I mean, look, one of the things that's sort of interesting is we might say we always think we're making progress.
Mhm.
But yet, if, in a sense, by saying, let's take what already exists and use that as a model for what should exist,
Yeah.
then, you know, it's interesting that, for example, many religions have taken that point of view. There is a sacred book that got written at time X, and it defines how people should act for all future time. And that's, it's a model that people have operated with. And in a sense, this is a version of that kind of statement. It's like take the 2023 version of sort of how the world has exposed itself and use that to define what the world should do in the future,
But
so to
it's not,
speak.
it's an imprecise definition, right? Because just like with religious texts and with GPT, the human interpretation of what GPT says will be will be the perturbation in the system. It'll be the noise. It'll be full of uncertainty. It's not like GPT, Chat GPT will tell you exactly what to do. It'll
Right?
tell you a narrative of what, like it's like a turn the other cheek kind of narrative, right? That's not a fully instructive narrative.
Well,
Uh,
until the AIs control all the systems in the world.
they will be able to very precisely tell you what to
Well,
do.
they'll do what they'll
Oh
they'll
boy,
just do this or that thing. And not only that, they'll be auto suggesting to each person, do this next, do that next.
yeah.
So I think it's a slightly more prescriptive situation than one has typically seen. But I think this whole question of sort of what what's left for the humans, so to speak. To what extent do we, uh, you know, this idea that there is an existing kind of corpus of purpose for humans defined by what's on the internet and so on, that's an important thing. But then the question of sort of as we explore what we can think of as the computational universe, as we explore all these different possibilities for what we could do, all these different inventions we could make, all these different things, the question is which ones do we choose to follow? Those choices are the things that, in a sense, if the humans want to still have kind of human progress, that's what we get to make those choices, so to speak. In other words, there's this idea. If you say, let's take the kind of what exists today and use that as the determiner of all of what there is in the future, the thing that is sort of the opportunity for humans is there will be many possibilities thrown up. There are many different things that could happen or be done.
Mhm.
And the insofar as we want to be in the loop, the thing that makes sense for us to be in the loop doing is picking which of those possibilities we want.
But the degree to which there's a feedback loop, the idea that we're picking something starts becoming questionable because we're influenced by the very systems.
Absolutely.
Like if that becomes more and more source of our education and wisdom and
Absolutely.
knowledge.
Right. The AIs take over. I mean, I've thought for a long time that, it's the, AR auto suggestion that's really the thing that makes the AIs take over. It's just then the humans just follow, you know.
Yeah. We will no longer write emails to each other. We'll just send the auto-suggested email.
Yeah. Yeah. But the thing where humans are potentially in the loop is when there's a choice. And when there's a choice which we could make based on our kind of whole web of history and so on.
Yeah.
And that's insofar as it's all just, determined, the humans don't have a place. And by the way, I mean, at some level, uh, it's all kind of a complicated philosophical issue because at some level the universe is just doing what it does. We are parts of that universe that are necessarily doing what we do, so to speak. Yet we feel we have sort of agency in what we're doing, and that's its own separate kind of interesting
And
issue.
and we also kind of feel like we're the final destination of what the universe was meant to create. Uh, but we very well could be and likely are some kind of intermediate step, obviously.
Yeah.
Well, we're most certainly some intermediate step. The question is if there's some cooler, more complex, more interesting thing that's going
Oh
to be
yeah. The
materialized,
computational universe is full of such things.
but in our particular pocket specifically.
I
If this is
mean,
the best we're going to do or not, that's kind of a
we can make all kinds of interesting things in the computational universe. When we look at them, we say, yeah, that's a thing. We don't. It doesn't really connect with our current way of thinking about things. I mean, it's like in mathematics.
Mhm.
We've got certain theorems. There are about 3 or 4 million that human mathematicians have written down and published, and so on. But there are an infinite number of possible mathematical theorems. We just go out into the universe of possible theorems and pick another theorem, and then people will say, "Well, that's." They look at it and they say, "I don't know what this theorem means. It's not connected to the things that are part of kind of the web of history that we're dealing with." I think one point to make about sort of understanding AI and its relationship to us is as we have this kind of whole infrastructure of AIs doing their thing and doing their thing in a way that is perhaps not readily understandable by us humans, you might say that's a very weird situation. How come we have built this thing that behaves in a way that we can't understand, that's full of computational irreducibility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? What is this? What's it going to feel like when the world is run by AIs whose operations we can't understand?
Mhm.
And the thing one realizes is actually we've seen this before. That's what happens when we exist in the natural world. The natural world is full of things that operate according to definite rules. They have all kinds of computational irreducibility. We don't understand what the natural world is doing. Occasionally, and when you say, are the AIs going to wipe us out, for example? Well, it's kind of like, is the machination of the AIs going to lead to this thing that eventually comes and destroys the species?
Mhm.
Well, we can also ask the same thing about the natural world. Are the machination of the natural world going to eventually lead to this thing that's going to, make the earth explode or something like this? Those are questions. And insofar as we think we understand what's happening in the natural world, that's a result of science and natural science and so on. One of the things we can expect when there's this giant infrastructure of the AIs is that's where we have to kind of invent a new kind of natural science that kind of is the natural science that explains to us how the AIs work. I mean, it's kind of like we can we have a I don't know a horse or something, and we're trying to ride the horse and go from here to there. We don't really understand how the horse works inside, but we can get certain rules and certain approaches that we take to persuade the horse to go from here to there and take us there. And that's the same type of thing that we're kind of dealing with the sort of incomprehensible computationally irreducible AIs, but we can we can find these kind of pockets of reducibility that we can kind of, I don't know, we're grabbing onto the mane of the horse or something to be able to ride it. Or we figure out, if we do this or that to ride the horse, that's a successful way to get it to do what we're interested in doing.
There does seem to be a difference between a horse and a large language model or something that could be called AGI connected to the internet. So let me just ask you about big philosophical question about the threats of these things. There's a lot of people like Eliezer Yudkowsky who worry about the existential risks of AI systems. Is
Uh-huh.
that something that you worry about? Sometimes when you're building an incredible system like Wolfram Alpha, you can kind of get lost in it.
Oh, I try and think a little bit about the implications of what one's doing.
It's like the Manhattan Project kind of situation where you're like, it's some of the most incredible physics and engineering being done, but it's like, huh, where's this gonna go?
I think some of these arguments about kind of, there'll always be a smarter AI, there'll always be, and eventually the AIs will get smarter than us, and then all sorts of terrible things will happen. To me, some of those arguments remind me of kind of the ontological arguments for the existence of God and things like this. They're kind of arguments that are based on some particular model, fairly simple model often, of kind of there is always a greater this, that, and the other.
Mhm.
This is, and that's, those arguments what tends to happen in the sort of reality of how these things develop is that it's more complicated than you expect. That the kind of simple logical argument that says, oh, eventually there'll be a super intelligence and then it will, do this and that, turns out not to really be the story. It turns out to be a more complicated story. So, for example, here's an example of an issue. Is there an apex intelligence? Just like there might be an apex predator in some, ecosystem, is there going to be an apex intelligence, the most intelligent thing that there could possibly be, right? I think the answer is no. And in fact, we already know this, and it's a kind of a back to the whole computational irreducibility story. There's kind of a question of, even if you have sort of a Turing machine, and you have a Turing machine that runs as long as possible before it halts. You say, is this the machine? Is this the apex machine that does that? There will always be a machine that can go longer. And as you go out to the infinite collection of possible Turing machines, you'll never have reached the end, so to speak. You'll always be able to. It's kind of like the same question of whether there'll always be another invention.
Yeah,
Will you always be able to invent another thing? The answer is yes. There's an infinite tower of possible inventions.
that's one definition of apex. Uh, but the other is like, which I also thought you were, which I also think might be true, is there a species that's the apex intelligence right now on Earth? So it's not trivial to say that humans are that.
Yeah, it's not trivial. I agree. It's a, I think one of the things that I I've long been curious about kind of other intelligences, so to speak. I mean, I view intelligence is like computation, and it's kind of a, you have the set of rules, you deduce what happens. um, I have tended to think now that there's this sort of specialization of computation that is sort of a consciousness like thing that has to do with these, computational boundedness, single thread of experience, these kinds of things that are the specialization of computation that corresponds to a somewhat human like experience of the world.
Mhm.
Now the question is, so that's, there may be other intelligences like, the aphorism, the weather has a mind of its own. It's a different kind of intelligence that can compute all kinds of things that are hard for us to compute, but it is not well aligned with us, with the way that we think about things. It doesn't think the way we think about things. And in this idea of different intelligences, every different mind, every different human mind is a different intelligence that thinks about things in different ways. And in terms of the kind of formalism of our physics project, we talk about this idea of rulal space, the space of all possible sort of rule systems, and different minds are, in a sense, at different points in rulal space. Human minds, ones that have grown up with the same kind of culture and ideas and things like this, might be pretty close in rulal space, pretty easy for them to communicate, pretty easy to translate, pretty easy to move from one place in rulal space that corresponds to one mind to another place in rulal space that corresponds to another sort of nearby mind.
Mhm.
When we deal with kind of more distant things in rulal space, like the pet cat or something, the pet cat has some aspects that are shared with us. The emotional responses of the cat are somewhat similar to ours, but the cat is further away in rulal space than people are. And so then the question is, can we identify can we make a translation from our thought processes to the thought processes of a cat or something like this? And, what will we get when what will happen when we get there? And I think it's the case that many animals, I don't know, dogs, for example, they have elaborate olfactory systems. They have sort of the smell architecture of the world, so to speak,
Mhm.
in a way that we don't. And so, if you were sort of talking to the dog and you could, communicate in a language, the dog will say, well, this is you know, a flowing, smelling, this, that, and the other thing, concepts that we just don't have any idea about. Now, what's interesting about that is one day we will have chemical sensors that do a really pretty good job. We'll have artificial noses that
Mhm.
work pretty well, and we might have our augmented reality systems show us kind of the same map that the dog could see and things like this. So similar to what happens in the dog's brain. And eventually, we will have kind of expanded in rulal space to the point where we will have those same sensory experiences that dogs have, and we will have internalized what it means to have, the smell landscape or whatever.
Hmm.
And so then we will have kind of colonized that part of rulal space until we haven't gone. Some things that animals and so on do, we sort of successfully understand. Others we do not. And the question of what is the what representation, how do we convert things that animals think about to things that we can think about? That's not a trivial thing. And I've long been curious. I had a very bizarre project at one point of trying to make an iPad game that a cat could win against its owner.
It feels like there's a deep philosophical goal there, though.
Yes, yes. I mean, I was curious if if pets can work in Minecraft or something
Hmm.
and can construct things, what will they construct? And will what they construct be something where we look at it and we say, "Oh yeah, I recognize that," or will it be something that looks to us like something that's out there in the computational universe that one of my cellular automata might have produced, where we say, "Oh yeah, I can kind of see it operates according to some rules. I don't know why you would use those rules. I don't know why you would care."
Yeah, I actually just to link on that seriously. Is there a connector in the real space between you and a cat, where the cat could legitimately win? So iPad is a very limited interface.
Yeah,
I wonder if there's a game where cats win.
I think the problem is that cats don't tend to be that interested in what's happening on the iPad.
Oh, so
But I think,
yeah, that's an interface issue,
yeah,
probably.
right,
Yeah.
right, right. No, I think it is likely that, I mean, there are plenty of animals that would successfully eat us if we were, if we were exposed to them. And so there's, it's going to pounce faster than we can get out of the way and so on. So there are plenty of, and probably it's going to, we think we've hidden ourselves, but we haven't successfully hidden
But
ourselves,
that's a
whatever.
physical strength. I wonder if there's something more in the realm of intelligence, where an animal like a cat
Right.
could
Well, I think there are things
outsmart
certainly
us.
in terms of the speed of processing certain kinds of
Sure.
things, for sure. I mean, the question of what, you know, is there a game of chess, for example? Is there cat chess
Yeah.
that the cats could play against each other? And if we tried to play a cat, we'd always lose. I
Yeah.
don't know.
It might have to do with speed, but it might have to do with concepts also.
It
There might
might.
be concepts in the cat's head.
I tend to think that our species, from its invention of language, has managed to build up this kind of tower of abstraction that, for things like a chess-like game, will make us win. In other words, we've
Yeah.
become, through the fact that we've kind of experienced language and learnt abstraction, we've sort of become smarter at those kinds of abstract kinds of things. Now, that doesn't make us smarter at catching a mouse or something. It makes us smarter at the things that we've chosen to sort of to concern ourselves, which are these kind of abstract things.
Yeah.
And I think this is again back to the question of what does one care about? If one's the cat. If you have the discussion with a cat, if we can translate things to have the discussion with the cat will say, you know, I'm very excited that uh, this light is moving. And we'll say, "Why do you care?" And the cat will say, "That's the most important thing in the world,
Yeah.
that this thing moves around." I mean, it's like when you look at archaeological remains and you say, "These people had this, belief system about this, and that was the most important thing in the world to them." And now we look at it and say we don't know what the point of it was. I mean, I've been curious. There are these handprints on caves from 20,000 or more years ago, and it's like nobody knows what these handprints were there for.
Mhm.
You know that they may have been a representation of the most important thing you can imagine. They may just have been some kid who rubbed their hands in the mud and stuck them on the walls of the cave. We don't know. And I think, but this whole question of what is when you say this question of sort of what's the smartest thing around, there's the question of what kind of computation you're trying to do. If you're saying, if you say you've got some well-defined computation, and how do you implement it? Well, you could implement it by nerve cells, firing. You can implement it with silicon and electronics. You can implement it by some kind of molecular computation process in the human immune system or in some molecular biology kind of thing. There are different ways to implement it. And I think this question of sort of those different implementation methods will be at different speeds. They'll be able to do different things. If you say, which, so an interesting question would be, um, what kinds of abstractions are most natural in these different kinds of systems? So for a cat, it's, for example, the visual scene that we see. We pick out certain objects, we recognize, certain things in that visual scene. A cat might, in principle, recognize different things.
Mhm.
I suspect, biological evolution is very slow. And I suspect what a cat notices is very similar. And we even know that from some
Mhm.
neurophysiology. What a cat notices is very similar to what we notice. Of course, there's one obvious difference is cats have only two kinds of color receptors, so they don't see in the same kind of color that we do. Now, we say we're better. We have three color receptors, red, green, blue. We're not the overall winner. I
Mhm.
think the mantis shrimp is the overall winner with 15 color receptors, I think. So it can kind of make distinctions that with our current, like the mantis shrimp's view of reality is at least in terms of color, is much richer than ours.
Mhm.
Um, Now, but what's interesting is how do we get there? So imagine we have this augmented reality system that is even, it's seeing into the infrared, into the ultraviolet, things like this, and it's translating that into something that is connectable to our brains, either through our eyes or more directly into our brains. Um, you know, then eventually our kind of web of the types of things we understand will extend to those kinds of constructs, just as they have extended. I mean, there are plenty of things where we see them in the modern world because we made them with technology, and now we understand what that is.
Mhm.
But if we'd never seen that kind of thing, we wouldn't have a way to describe it, we wouldn't have a way to understand it, and so on.
All right. So that actually stemmed from our conversation about whether AI is going to kill all of us. And we've discussed this kind of spreading of intelligence through rural space. That in practice, it just seems that things get more complicated. Things are more complicated than the story of, well, if you build a thing that's plus one intelligence, that thing will be able to build the thing that's plus two intelligence and plus three intelligence, and that will be exponential. It'll become more intelligent exponentially faster, and so on until it completely destroys everything. Um, but that intuition might still not be so simple, but might still carry validity. And there's two interesting trajectories here. One, a super intelligent system remains in rule proximity to humans, to where
Yep.
we're like, holy crap, this thing is really intelligent. Let's elect the president. And then there could be perhaps more terrifying intelligence that starts moving away. They might be around us now, that are moving far away in rulio space, but they're still sharing physical resources with us, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so they can rob us of those physical resources and destroy humans just kind of casually,
Yeah.
just just
Like nature could.
like nature could. But it seems like there's something unique about AI systems where um, there is this kind of exponential growth, like the way, well, sorry, nature has so many things in it. One of the things that nature has, which is very interesting, are viruses, for example.
Hmm.
There is systems within nature that have this kind of exponential effect. And that terrifies us humans because again, there's only 8 billion of us and you can just kind of, it's not that hard to just kind of whack them all real
Yeah.
quick. So, I mean, is that something you think about? The,
Yeah. I've
the,
thought about that. Yes.
the
I
threat of
mean,
it. I mean, are you as concerned about it as somebody like Eliezer Yudkowsky, for example? Just big, big, painful negative effects of AI on society.
you know, no, but perhaps that's because I'm intrinsically an optimist.
Yeah.
Um, I mean, I think that there are things. I think the thing that one one sees is there's going to be this one thing and it's going to just zap everything.
Yeah.
Somehow, I maybe I have faith in computational irreducibility, so to speak,
Mhm.
that there's always unintended little corners that, it's just like somebody says, I'm going to, oh, I don't know, somebody has some bioweapon and they say we're going to release this and it's going to do all this harm. But then it turns out it's more complicated than that because, you know, the kind of some humans are different and, the exact way it works is a little different than you expect. It's something where sort of the great big you smash the thing with something, the asteroid collides with the earth
Yeah.
and it kind of, and yes, the earth is cold for 2 years or something and, you know then lots of things die, but not everything dies. And it's, there's usually, I mean, I kind of this is in a sense the sort of story of computational irreducibility. There are always unexpected corners, there are always unexpected consequences, and I don't think that they kind of whack it over the head with something and then it's all gone is, that can obviously happen. The Earth can be swallowed up in a black hole or something, and then it's kind of presumably all over. The but I think this question of what, what do I think the realistic paths are? I think that there will be sort of an increasing. I mean, the people have to get used to phenomena like computational irreducibility. There's an idea that we built the machines so we can understand what they do, and we're going to be able to control what happens. Well, that's not really right. Now the question is the result of that lack of control going to be that the machines kind of conspire and sort of wipe us out? Maybe just because I'm an optimist, I don't tend to think that that's in the cards. I think that as a realistic thing, I suspect, what will sort of emerge maybe is kind of an ecosystem of the AIs, just as, again, I don't really know. I mean, this is something it's hard to be clear about what will happen. I mean, I think that there are a lot of sort of details of, what could we do? What systems in the world could we connect an AI to? I have to say, I was just a couple of days ago, I was working on this ChatGPT plugin kit that we have for Wolfram Language, okay? Where you can create a plugin and it runs Wolfram Language code,
Mhm.
and it can run Wolfram Language code back on your own computer.
Yeah.
And I was thinking, well, I can just make it, I can tell ChatGPT, create a piece of code and then just run it on my computer. And I'm like, that sort of personalizes for me the what could possibly go wrong, so to speak.
Was that exciting or scary, that possibility?
It was a little bit scary actually, because it's kind of like I realize I'm delegating to the AI, just write a piece of code. You know, you're in charge. Write a piece of code, run it on my computer, and pretty soon all my files can
That's
be
like
deleted.
that's like Russian roulette, but, like, much more complicated version of
Yes,
that.
yes, yes, right.
That's a good drinking game. I don't know. So what
Well,
uh,
right. I mean, that's
it depends
why
how much you're
that
drinking.
but that it's an interesting question then. If you do that, right,
Yeah.
what is the sandboxing that you should have? And that's sort of a version of that question for the world. That is, as soon as you put the AIs in charge of things, how many constraints should there be on these systems before you put the AIs in charge of all the weapons and all these different kinds of systems?
Well, here's the fun part about sandboxes is, the AI knows about them. It has the tools to, crack them.
Look, the fundamental problem of computer security
Yeah.
is computational irreducibility.
Yes.
Because the fact is, any sandbox is never it's never going to be a perfect sandbox. If you want the system to be able to do interesting things, I mean, this is the problem that's happened, the generic problem of computer security, that as soon as you have your, firewall that is sophisticated enough to be a universal computer, that means it can do anything. And so long as if you find a way to poke it so that you actually get it to do that universal computation thing, that's the way you kind of crawl around and get it to do the thing that it wasn't intended to do. And that's sort of another version of computational irreducibility is you can kind of you get it to do the thing you didn't expect it to do, so to speak.
There's so many interesting possibilities here that manifest themselves from the computational reducibility here. It's just so many things can happen because in digital space, things move so quickly. You can have a chatbot, you can have a piece of code that you could basically have ChatGPT generate viruses
Yeah.
accidentally or on purpose, and digital viruses.
Yes.
and they could be brain viruses too. They convince, kind of like phishing emails.
Yes.
They can convince you of stuff.
Yes, and no doubt you can, in a sense, we've had the loop of the machine learning loop of making things that convince people of things
Yeah,
is surely going to get easier to do.
yeah,
And, then what does that look like? Well, it's again, we humans are, this is a new environment for us. And admittedly, it's an environment which a little bit scarily is changing much more rapidly than, I mean, people worry about, climate change is going to happen over hundreds of years. And, the environment is changing, but the environment for, in the kind of digital environment might change in 6 months.
So one of the relevant concerns here, in terms of the impact of GPT on society, is the nature of truth that's relevant to Wolfram Alpha, because computation through symbolic reasoning that's embodied in Wolfram Alpha as the interface. There's a kind of sense that what Wolfram Alpha tells me is true.
Hmm. So we hope.
Yeah, I mean, you could probably analyze that. You could show, you can't prove that it's always going to be true, computational reducibility, but it's going to be more
Yeah,
true than not.
it's look, the fact is it will be the correct consequence of the rules you've specified. And insofar as it talks about the real world, that is our job in sort of curating and collecting data to make sure that that data is quotes as true as possible. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's always an interesting question. I mean, for us, our operational definition of truth is, somebody says, who's the best actress?
Mhm,
Who knows?
mhm.
But somebody won the Oscar, and that's a definite fact.
Yeah,
And so, that's the kind of thing that we can make computational as a piece of truth.
yeah,
If you ask, these things which, a sensor measured this thing, it did it this way. A machine learning system, this particular machine learning system recognized this thing. That's a sort of a definite a fact, so to speak.
hmm,
And that's there is a good network of those things in the world. It's certainly the case that particularly when you say, is so and so a good person,
yeah.
you know that's a hopelessly, we might have a computational language definition of good. I don't think it'd be very interesting because that's a very messy kind of concept, not really amenable to kind of, I think as far as we will get with those kinds of things is I want X. There's a kind of meaningful calculus of I want X, and that has various consequences. I mean, I'm not sure. I haven't thought this through properly, but I think, a concept like is so and so a good person? Is that true or not? That's a mess.
That's a mess that's amenable to computation. I think it's a mess when humans try to define what's good, like through legislation. But when humans try to define what's good through literature, through history books, through poetry, it starts
Well,
being
I
more
don't know.
clear.
I mean, that particular thing, it's kind of like, we're going into kind of the ethics of what counts as good, so to
Yeah,
speak, and what do we think is right, and so on. And I think
yeah.
that's a thing which, one feature is we don't all agree about that. There's no theorems about kind of there's no theoretical framework that says this is this is the way that ethics has to be.
Well, first of all, there's stuff we kind of agree on, and there's some empirical backing for what works and what doesn't, from just even the morals and ethics within religious texts. So we seem to mostly agree that murder is bad. There's certain universals that seem to emerge.
I wonder whether murder of an AI is bad.
Well, I tend to think yes, but and I think we're gonna have to contend with that question. Oh, and I wonder what AI would say.
Yeah. Well, I think, one of the things with AIs is it's one thing to wipe out that AI that is only, has no owner. You can easily imagine an AI kind of hanging out on the you know on the internet without having any particular owner or anything like that. And then you say, well, what harm does it? It's okay to get rid of that AI.
Hmm.
Of course, if the AI has 10,000 friends who are humans, and all those 10,000 humans will be incredibly upset that this AI just got exterminated,
Mhm.
it becomes a slightly different, more entangled story. But yeah, no, I think that this question about what do humans agree about, it's you know, there are certain things that human laws have tended to consistently agree about.
Mhm.
There have been times in history when people have sort of gone away from certain kinds of laws, even ones that we would now say, how could you possibly have not done it that way? That just doesn't seem right at all. Um, but I think, I mean, this question of what I don't think one can say beyond saying if you have a set of rules that will cause the species to go extinct,
Mhm.
that's probably, you could say
Suetber, parecía falta, esto es lo que cobra el árbitro, anterior retrotanae, hay tiro libre que corresponde al Celta de Vigo en casi 13 de juego.
Sí, sí, falta de Renormand, ahí ya se reanuda, digo.
Habrá tiro libre entonces que corresponde al Celta